Since the blue and gold dress, the internet has been fascinated with color theory. And I'll be honest with you guys, I'm no scientist. I'm not gonna sit here and try to explain what the hell is even going on with this one. It's probably just a really weird shadow or something, but that's the whole point. I'm not a scientist, I'm a painter. I like making paintings with oil paint, and knowing a little bit of science does go a long way, but the internet seems to conflate knowing lots of niche small facts with actual real painting skills. And those little niche, bite-sized cool color theory tricks go a lot more viral than the very basic amounts of theory, but incredibly high amounts of skill that go into making the incredible paintings from art history that we all love. So I wanna do a little audit here today. Let's check in with the internet and see what it feels like to be a beginner learning about color for the first time online. All right, we got 15 million views on this video, and that's really not even an uncommon amount for this channel. So let's see what happens when you mix Halo White with Bulgarian Rose. Guys, I think we need to start from the basics here and say that paint doesn't glow. That's just not how any of this works. I think the color mixing channels might have started to lose some steam and they needed a new gimmick. This book, Color and Light by the excellent painter James Gurney, has a really nice overview of color in it, and it has a section on luminescence, of which we have bioluminescence, which is when living creatures like fireflies or jellyfish give off a glow. But I don't think that paint is made out of plankton. So it could be fluorescence, which is light that is emitted from objects that are receiving UV lights, like uranium dishware that glows under a black light. But this is in a brightly lit studio room. You can barely even tell that uranium dishware is glowing during the daytime. So there is something called radioluminescence, which is when things that are radioactive enough start to glow, and you can buy little vials of tritium online for this reason, but there's a reason why these photos are being taken in the pitch black. Because this $200 tritium flashlight I found is rated at 0.01 lumens. You would not be able to see this stuff at all under bright studio lighting used for filming. There are a lot of theories in the comment sections of these videos, and all are incredibly wrong. But thankfully, we have someone drop shipping crap on TikTok to give us the real answer.
What is Halo White? Like this video, Halo White plus Halo White, and it just makes this like almost angelic shade? What is this? I've been asked a couple times if this is special effects, is it real? And it's actually both. The type of paint they are using is a glitter-filled white acrylic paint. It is artificially reflective. Almost like the pearls around my neck, they shine more than the white on my shirt because there are chemicals that literally reflect the sun and light as a whole way better than it's supposed to. Now this white is covered in a warm light and then the exposure is turned all the way up. It's not exactly special effects. The camera is capturing this.
Why did we need to show this color on the cock and ball mold? Well, the reason is because he Googled for Halo White paint and found out that the Toyota GR86 has a pearlescent white paint option called Halo White. And then he made the leap that this must be some sort of pearlescent automobile paint, which is what this image is from. This is completely different from wet acrylic or oil paint in every conceivable way. And we just need to think here for a moment. In what world does mixing white and purplish red make a deep, rich purple color? If you're going to add a big glob of white to any color, it's going to become a more grayish, whitish version of itself. Not something that is more saturated than the starting components. That's just not possible. If we go frame by frame and we look very closely at this video, you can see a bluish hue around the edges of the white paint when it's first scooped. And then when going frame by frame during the mixing process, we see a lot of pure blue paint show up. Because this isn't Halo White, it's a bright blue color, which has been selected using a color qualifier in a video editing software like DaVinci Resolve here. And then this selects everything in the blue range of hue. And then we overexpose it to a pure white. Then we can add some glow and halation filters on top. And now we can say hello to the new whitest paint on Earth, Jake's Thorium 238 White. I feel like my eyes are melting just staring into this beautiful color. I eated all the 238 White, Jake. Artists, we sit at our desks and our easels all day, and our way to relax after that is sitting on our phones watching YouTube. And if your back is shaped like a pistol shrimp, let's fix that with today's video sponsor, ZocDoc. ZocDoc is a free website that helps you find and book high-quality in-network doctors, so that way you can find someone you love. Someone that actually fits you, not just whoever you happen to find. I can pull up a list of all the physical therapy providers in my area and find the right one. So instead of guessing or putting it off, I can actually do something about it. You just gotta type in whatever you got going on, and then boom, more than 150,000 providers across all 50 states. Give me that Zoc, doc. There are over 200 specialties. You can choose whether you prefer in-person or video, and you can read thousands of verified patient reviews to get a feel on your doc before they give you that Zoc. So you're not walking in blind. You actually know what you're getting into. You'll get the care you need fast with real-time availability and instant bookings. Typically, you can get appointments in 1 to 3 days, sometimes even on the same day. And instead of calling offices and waiting on hold, ZocDoc shows you doctors' real-time availability. So when you see a time that works, you can click and book instantly. No phone calls. In-person visits, video visits, if that's easier, it just fits into your life instead of becoming another thing that you have to plan around. Guys, it's very important to take care of your physical and mental health so that you can have a long-lasting career as an artist. And you want to be able to find the right doctors to work with your insurance for that. ZocDoc is the place to start. If you're looking to find a doctor, give ZocDoc a try. It's easy and free, so you got nothing to lose by giving it a shot. Click the link in the description to find and instantly book a top-rated, in-network doctor today. Let's make this a year of health.
I think you only knew Halo White was real and fake because you follow me for more color stuff just like this.
I would love to follow the guy that thought this was cock and ball white for more color theory advice. Let's do that.
This guy says, I could make white. He's got blue, yellow, red. No, you can't, and I'm 100% sure about it. So first off, what he's using is called additive color mixing.
No, it's not.
And you can't make white with additive color mixing. It's just not possible.
Yes, you can. That's literally exactly how white is made.
But maybe this guy's figured it out. I got tagged in this video like 40 times. Green plus blue plus red does not equal white? What? You expect me to believe he's created a...
Okay, so what's happening here is he's debunking a fake video, but he's getting almost every single term completely wrong. This is kind of a nice opportunity to just answer the question of what even is color mixing, though. There are 2 types of color science. One is what gives our monitors and phone screens a full range of dynamic colors. It gives a full range of color to almost everything in our lives. And this is called additive color mixing. If you have a red light bulb and a blue light bulb and a green light bulb and you overlay them all on top of each other, you get white light. That's because red, green, and blue are the 3 colors that the cones in our eyes see. And there's a lot of scientists out there that can go much deeper on that. But luckily for you and me, we're painters, and you actually really don't have to care that much about this one if you don't want to, because this only works for things that emit light, and paint doesn't. Whenever we mix paint together, we're using a different system of color theory called subtractive color mixing. This is a fake TikTok where a guy is mixing red, green, and blue together and then pretending it makes white, which it would if it were additive color mixing, but it's paint, so it's subtractive and it would make a brownish black. When you mix paints together, you have to lose saturation. You can't add colors together and make something that is brighter than when it started like you can in additive color mixing. You can think of it this way. You're always diluting the base paint that you start from by mixing anything else into it. When you dilute something, it has to be weaker than what it started from, meaning the resulting mix can never be more intense than the base components. In a very simplified way, if we were to mix blue and orange together, we can draw a line between them on the color wheel. And the resulting mix will be somewhere on this line depending on the quantity of each that we mix together. But it can't just magically go upwards towards a new color like pink.
If you think color stuff is cool, then follow us for more.
I will not. And this, my friends, brings us into the magical world of color theory on the internet. It's pretty bad. And even when it's not so scientifically bad, I think that it overcomplicates color and painting to the point where people are completely paralyzed trying to do what I think should be simple task of mixing colors. And where this issue presents itself the most is the debate of red, yellow, blue versus cyan, magenta, and yellow. This creator has about 20 videos of this with tens of millions of total views, selling us on why we should try this new color palette.
The 3 painting primaries are red, yellow, and blue, right? Wrong. It's time to meet magenta, yellow, and cyan. These 3 primaries are known as a CMY palette and can mix any color on the rainbow, including some of the old primaries. Let me go ahead and prove it to you. As we mix the right ratio of magenta and cyan together, we'll notice that instead of making a purple, they make much closer to a primary blue. And if you didn't know, if you can mix a color using 2 other colors, that dethrones it as a primary hue. When we mix our cyan and yellow together, you get one of the most beautiful greens possible. If you have any experience using the old primaries to get green, you'll understand just how hard it is to get this bright lime hue. And lastly, when we mix our yellow and magenta together, we'll notice that instead of making an orange like when you mix yellow and red, we actually make the most beautiful, perfect primary red, which like before, completely dethrones red as a primary color.
So basically throughout most of art history, we've considered red, yellow, and blue to be the primary colors. But our understanding of color theory has developed a lot around the turn of the 20th century and throughout it. You might have heard that printers use pigments like cyan, magenta, and yellow as their inks. And that's because, like the creator said, these are actually the primary colors of the subtractive color model. We thought it was red, yellow, and blue for a while, but it's not. It took the internet by storm the past few years that the only reason people use red, yellow, and blue on their painting palettes are because they're outdated, and they're just doing what they're used to or what they learned as kids. And I can tell that a lot of the people that make this argument to use CMY instead just can't have that much painting experience. This video is correct. Primary colors are colors that you can't mix from any other colors. And you can make red out of magenta and yellow, and you can make blue from cyan and magenta. So the primary colors are absolutely cyan, magenta, and yellow. That's just science, and I'm not going to contest that. But theoretical color science and actual paint mixing are completely different. Now, the argument for why we should be using CMY as our primary colors instead of red, yellow, and blue looks very convincing. In this creator's color tests, she mixes blue and cyan with the same shades of yellow. And you'll see in any CMY test that the CMY colors will consistently produce a much wider range of more saturated colors than red, yellow, and blue. And to understand why this is, and also why I really don't think that it's that big of a deal, I want to introduce you guys to the idea of color gamut. This is a color wheel. I already showed you that if you place two colors on the wheel, when you mix them together, it creates a color somewhere on the line that connects them. But if we add a third, it expands to a triangle. And anything inside of this triangle is roughly a visualization of all the colors that a palette of cadmium red, cadmium yellow, and ultramarine blue can mix. That's a pretty typical red, yellow, and blue palette. This triangle is called the color gamut. And if we compare that to a CMY palette, we can see that there is a way larger gamut, meaning that the CMY palette can mix a much wider range of colors, especially saturated colors. And that's great. If you're stranded on a desert island and you only get to choose 3 paint tubes, then you should probably pick CMY, but that's not the situation we're in at all. And there's actually just as many disadvantages to using CMY as there are not. Let's say we were gonna paint a portrait. I'm gonna pull a highlight, shadow, and mid-tone color from each of these skin tones, and then I'm gonna plot them onto this color wheel. And you can see that all of these colors are well within the range of what RY pigments are capable of mixing. And actually, funny enough, this very saturated dark red skin tone is actually a little bit outside of the range of CMY. So for many purposes, like painting portraits or something, CMY might not provide us with that many extra colors than we actually already have with RYB. Apparently I forgot to record this part, so you guys get editor Jake. And also, I'm anime now, I guess, so that's happening. The whole claim of CMY is that you can mix a primary red by mixing yellow and magenta, and this is absolutely theoretically true, but in reality, you actually can't mix cadmium red from quinacridone magenta and cadmium yellow.
It's not even close.
And you can pick whatever magenta and yellow pigments you want for this, you're just never gonna hit a fiery, warm red like cadmium red. So if you can't mix it, does that mean it's a primary? Yes, it does. Dioxazine purple can't be mixed from quinacridone magenta and phthalo blue.
Again, dioxazine purple, way better than the CMY version.
So that's a primary color too. And viridian green can't be mixed from cadmium yellow and phthalo blue, so that's a primary.
And the green does get pretty close to viridian green, I definitely can admit that, but they're very different paints. The viridian green is far more transparent, with a really nice black jewel-like quality that comes from its nice transparency.
And the list goes on and on. You can't mix any color that's outside of this triangle with the CMY palette. So anything outside of the perimeter of this triangle is a primary color if you want. None of this theoretical color theory stuff actually matters as soon as we bring it into real pigments. Because phthalo blue or any other cyan pigment isn't a theoretical, real, perfect cyan color. It's just a lab-made chemical that looks like pretty cyan. Actually, there's not really a lot of great cyan pigments out there at all. It's very difficult in oil painting. There are no perfect pigment primaries because pigments all have their own unique properties because they're not waves of light electromagnetic energy. They're real things. things that interact in different ways. They're different tinting strengths and transparencies.
But I want to show you guys what a color gamut actually looks like with real paint. So I'm just going to mix this entire gamut of CMY. All right, now we'll do this for the RYB palette. My triangle skills have kind of slipped, I guess. This one was much better looking, but nonetheless, we can see that the CMY palette is capable of achieving much higher saturation green colors, especially. The greens over here are very faded. And again, the purples over here are much more saturated. These ones get very kind of blackish, a little bit grayish over here. So the CMY palette mixes more saturated colors. Okay, Jake, so CMY has a wider gamut, so why are you clutching on to your RYB? It can mix more colors in RYB. But now we're gonna go back to the portrait painting example. I wanna match this skin tone color exactly, first using RYB. So first thing I'm gonna do to make a skin tone is mix red and yellow to make a brown. I forgot I needed a little bit of white on my palette. And clearly this is far more saturated than our sample. So I'm gonna add a little bit of white, and I'm gonna add a little bit of blue just to neutralize it and make it more gray. And I'm gonna continue adding blue and white in small quantities. And we're starting to get very close, but we're a little bit too light now I'm seeing, or dark rather. I'm gonna add some white here. Maybe needs to darken up a little bit. There we go, that is getting really darn close. It needs to get a little bit darker, so I'm gonna add a little bit of blue and a little bit of red. These are kind of basically opposites. Maybe a touch of orange, and that's gonna turn the red that's in there into orange, which is the opposite of blue, which will make it darker. If we mix two things that are opposites of each other, they're gonna get darker. Yeah, and I'm gonna call that pretty much an exact match. And now let's do it with CMY. So we need to make kind of a brownish red again. So we'll yellow and magenta to make orange. And then we're also gonna need to add a decent amount of phthalo in here, even though I went too hard. And the thing about CMY is it's so saturated. Not that these aren't extremely saturated too. You know, normally I would have a yellow ochre or something like that in there. It'd be a much better starting point. But CMY, it's even further out on the wide ends of the gamut, and if I want to mix a skin tone or most things in nature, they're not on the ends of saturation. I'm starting further away from where I want to be. And we need more red, so I'm going to add more cyan and yellow in there. But this is just the exact same process from last time. Just the first thing I do is I mix them together a little bit more to make more gray. That way I can get closer to the color that I actually want to wind up at. I'm really spending all of my time not adjusting the color temperature, but just adjusting how saturated it is. Yeah, okay, I'd say that's pretty much perfect match, especially to the one that we have over here. There's not a whole lot of difference mixing most colors with RYB versus CMY, because most of your colors are probably going to be within that gamut anyways, and the only difference is you're starting from farther away when you're mixing with CMY.
But Jake, you say, not everyone wants to paint boring, realistic paintings. People like to make paintings with wild, saturated colors, and that takes advantage of CMY. Yeah, that's actually exactly my point. We should use colors that work for what we want to do. There is no primary set of colors that works for everything. If you want to paint wild saturated colors, then you're also going to want to add a cadmium red on, and a phthalo green, and a dioxazine purple, and you'll probably want warm and cool variants of all the colors that you have. So you might like alizarin crimson for a very cool red, or Hansa yellow for a very bright but slightly more transparent yellow. This entire argument of CMY versus RYB is deeply flawed to me. No one paints with only 3 colors on their palette. That just doesn't exist. You don't get enough range out of any 3 colors. And even if you did, you still want convenience colors. Because for reasons that I described earlier, it's a pain in the ass to mix skin tones without yellow ochre, because yellow ochre is very naturally occurring in the starting point of most skin tones. And that goes for a whole lot of earth colors like burnt umber or sienna too. And that's what a convenience color is. It's a color that you can technically mix from other primary colors, but you use it so much, it's just worth having on hand so that you can mix things in that range faster. I never use sap green when making a portrait, but it's a really great warm green color to have on hand when painting landscapes, because a lot of other greens tend to be very cool and bluish. The first thing you do when mixing the vast majority of CMY colors is mix them all together to make gray. That way you can dull out the extreme saturation of them before pulling them into a more specific direction. And that's just wasteful. Cadmium yellow is way more expensive than yellow ochre. If you're going to mix a skin tone, then you should use the earth tones. It's not only more convenient, but it's less wasteful and cheaper. This logic maps on to most colors. It really just depends on what subject you're painting. That's what the purpose of a color palette is. It's never been about being a one-size-fits-all triad of colors that covers as much gamut as possible. It's about picking and choosing what colors you want for the task at hand. And it's pretty obvious that all of this color science isn't really required, because it was popularized after we had so many amazing 19th century painters making incredible paintings, like these beautiful, subtle, moody greens by Thomas Dewing, this absolutely incredible range of natural colors by George Roscros, and just zoom into any one part of a Fortuny painting and tell me that this guy didn't know he was missing out on a color. And of course, J.W.N. Turner back in the 1830s, being incredibly inventive with color and working with way less of the modern saturated pigments that were yet to be invented or popularized. You can dislike realist painting for being unoriginal all you want, but I do think it's a bit disingenuous when people don't admit that it takes an insanely high level of understanding of color to make work like this. It takes actually a far more sensitive and subtle control of color mixing to make works like this than it does to make, let's say, hyper-saturated abstract works. That's not a value judgment about whether historical painting is better or worse than modern or contemporary art. I personally don't believe one is better than the other. I don't think morally one is greater than the other either. It's all just art. I don't really care. I just want to present the case that people in art history had incredibly sophisticated understandings of color, and what they did with it, especially considering that they had much more limited choices of pigments, was incredible. It takes a lot of different pigments to make a painting like this. Whether you have RYB or CMY, it's pretty inconsequential, because no matter what you start with, you're going to add on a lot of purples and blues and multiple reds and convenience colors all the same. And I have proof of that from this time too. There's a book called How We Paint Today by Charles Moreau-Vauthier, and it has detailed notes on the processes, materials, and pigments used by artists around the late 19th century and the turn of the 20th century. It explicitly states the typical palette used by many famous painters from history, and interestingly, it has a good mix of academic and modern artists. An artist like Aman Jean is using 13 different pigments on his palette. Albert Andre is using 11, Leon Bonnat, an academic painter, is using 10, Carolus Duran, 17, D'Espagnat, 13, and I'll save you guys a bunch of time. There's a lot of painters in this book, and they're all basically using the same 8 to 20 pigments, most of them over 10. It's really just a matter of preference and how much mixing the painter wants to do by hand. Some painters just prefer having a lot of convenience colors ready, but no one is using less than 6 to 8 pigments. So is it CMY or RYB? Well, it's both, and then some more probably, a lot more. A lot of portrait painters like to use what's called the Zorn palette. When I teach people how to paint, this is actually what I like to start them out on before adding in more colors. So let's learn about the Zorn palette here.
Have you heard of the Zorn palette? This popular palette, inspired by 19th century Swedish artist Anders Zorn, relies on just 2 colors. The Zorn palette includes a warm red and an earth yellow, along with black and white, creating a powerful tool for representational portraits and figurative art. Anders Zorn, born in 1860, became known for his mastery with this minimal palette, though some art historians suggest he used a broader range of colors. In Zorn's less resolved works, it's easy to identify the 4 hues, which the artist displayed on his palette in a self-portrait.
This palette doesn't have green or blue in it. It only has grays, which can be very convincingly used to give the appearance of blue when you put them next to warm colors, but we should know at this point that all of this bright green and blue in the top of this painting is clearly not possible by only using the Zorn palette. When we look at Zorn's palette's gamut, purples and greens and blues are a particularly weak range of colors. It's just not possible to get them with these base components.
This minimalist approach connects to ancient practices at a time when fewer pigments were available, highlighting the Zorn palette's roots in art history. The Zorn palette is especially effective for capturing naturalistic skin tones.
And again, we can see this landscape in the background has some greens, which are not possible with the Zorn palette. And there's blues in this very next artwork. Now, this is a good video. It's totally fine to simplify topics down in short form content. But the idea that some artist contests that Zorn didn't actually paint with only these 4 pigments is made up, okay? It's just a fact that Zorn painted with way more than 4 pigments. Even just looking at his paintings clearly shows that. Zorn is actually quite well known for his naturalistic outdoor figure paintings. The Zorn palette is great for an academic portrait painted of someone inside of a studio, but I don't know if you guys have ever been outside before. It has a lot of colors, a lot more than this tiny range. People just like to take things way too literally online. The Zorn palette is great for starting out, and it's a nice base set of colors to always have on your palette, but that doesn't mean that the artist only ever used those paints. Zorn didn't even invent this palette. These are just mud colors. People have been painting with black, white, red, and yellow since the cave paintings, because these are by far the easiest pigments to find in nature. Emma Janssen did incredible research on Zorn's palettes and techniques and materials, and they did a bunch of X-ray testing and paint cross-section sampling and all that laser magnet shooting science stuff, all right? As well as the incredibly scientific act of just going to his historical studio and looking at the paint tubes that he actually used, which proved that he used far more colors than only the Zorn palette. More recent analysis of his palette has included a handful of modern synthetic pigments. These additional colors have been identified as zinc white, Palo Veronese green, chrome green, viridian, emerald green, Naples yellow, cadmium yellow, burnt sienna, madder lake, cobalt blue, and ultramarine blue. That's 4 greens, 2 blues, 2 yellows, a second red, and earth tone, in addition to the normal ones that he was already using. And I don't know, we really didn't need to look at a painting like this and ask if he used green. But it does seem like it's necessary sometimes, since people just want to look for the secret reason why they aren't as good as the masters from the past. If only they use the same exact color palette that the old master used. But really, painters from history just looked at what they saw, and if they needed some blue, then they put blue on their palette. Of course, though, I am talking about painters from the late 19th century, when a broad range of pigments was becoming available and archivally safe. A lot of color limitations before then were due to a lack of pigments that had not been synthesized or popularized yet, and artists were also very reluctant to try new pigments because they were not proven to be chemically stable over hundreds of years. The Zorn palette is a really good starting point. I made these color studies last year using almost entirely the Zorn palette, but I always keep an ultramarine blue on my palette because, where is it, this one? Like, this color just wouldn't be possible without it. If all you needed to paint was just the 3 most saturated CMY pigments possible, or a hyper-restricted Zorn palette, then why did Zorn have 4 different greens on his palette? The lack of understanding of color gamut has really sunk deep into how we approach our education. And I'm certain that all of you, if you have taken an art class before or just had any sort of art teacher or looked up advice online, you have heard somebody tell you this.
You have to stop using the color black. Use these 3 colors instead. Mix those colors together and you'll have a color that emulates black but without desaturating your colors.
This is so pervasive, and I just don't get it. Black is a color like anything else, and if controlled properly, it's an incredible tool to have on your palette. And I really want to understand where this sentiment comes from, because in my book of famous painters' palettes, you'll notice something that every single one of these entries has in common: ivory black. Basically, every single painter in art history had some form of black on their palette. And there are just countless examples of painters who use black achieving incredibly naturalistic or expressive painting. Black doesn't kill color, and there are orders of magnitude more evidence to support that than the idea that it does. On the grand scheme of things, almost every painter from history has used the color black. It's just one of those pigments that is incredibly easy to get. Carbon black is just burnt stuff, so it's always been a part of painting. Now, from some digging, it seems like the idea that you shouldn't use black comes from some of the Impressionists. But it's very important to note that many of the early Impressionists came from the studio of a teacher called Charles Gleyre in the middle of the 19th century. Renoir, Monet, Bazille, they all studied with Gleyre. A principle of Gleyre's teaching was that ivory black is the base of all tones. And Renoir and other Impressionists were a fan of this doctrine. Renoir related that black was essential to any palette. and that it's the queen of all colors. He had attempted to replace black with a mixture of red and cobalt blue, but finally returned at ivory black. So it's not unanimous that everyone just woke up one day and learned more about color theory and then threw out their black paint. This seems like a practice that was only common among a relatively small group of impressionists, which were the fringes of the art world in the 1860s and 70s. I'm going to be quoting The Art of Impressionism by Anthea Callan, specifically the chapter The Palette from Tonal to Spectral, which covers the different pigments and practices used from the more traditional academic ones at the beginning of the 19th century all the way through the Impressionists. Scientific analysis of Impressionist painting suggests that 1869 through 1870 was a watershed in the change of limited palette colors based on the spectrum. One witness, George Lecomte, has Pissarro as the first to use such a limited palette, from 1865. The painter expurgated from his palette firstly black, that non-color. Shortly afterwards, the ochres and the browns were proscribed. He only paints with the 6 colors of the rainbow. The accuracy of this evidence has been rightly questioned. Recent pigment analysis shows that earths and blacks remained in Pissarro's palette in the 1870s, though they were used in far smaller quantities than in the earlier 1860s. So the first Impressionists did make a push in the 1860s to remove black and earth colors from their palette. But it's very difficult to separate fact versus reality, especially when we're talking about artists of all people, who often have something to prove to the world. Popular myth about the Impressionists' restricted spectral palettes has tended to represent them as more limited than they actually were. This view was undoubtedly fueled by the artists themselves to reinforce the image of the authentic plein air painter, which has made the myth harder to dispel and the reality more intractable. In Monet's case, the myth-making is well documented, both his coyness over the extent of his studio-based work and his terse response as late as 1905 to an unwelcome inquiry relayed by Georges Durand-Ruel about the composition of his palette. In short, I use flake white, cadmium yellow, vermilion, red lake deep, cobalt blue, and viridian green, and that's all. But analysis of Monet's bathers at La Granuaire, I'm not doing the whole French thing this episode, alright? 1869 reveals a palette of 15 distinct pigments, as against 8 pigments at the beach of Trouville in 1870 and 9 for the Petit Bras of the Seine at Argenteuil, 1872. So we can see a varying palette size here, but never quite hitting that like 3 or 6 colors even. So it was quite common for artists to use palettes of varying sizes. Impressionists certainly tried to keep a more restricted palette, and many Impressionists experimented with those, but they were experiments, and frequently they went back to using more pigments, just like how Renoir tried mixing his own black, but eventually he went back to ivory black anyways. And on the topic of Impressionists using black, we have this. Black was deemed a non-color, the absence of light, which was problematic for the Impressionists. Yet black, most commonly ivory or bone black, appeared more frequently in Impressionist painting than the myth of the spectral palette allows, though it was rarely used in quantity. Almost universally, these painters employed colored blacks. These fall into 2 main categories, subtractive blacks and pigment blacks. When mixed, colored blacks combine subtractively. They absorb light, and the result is darker when they are combined than when they were as individual components. In theory, pigment primaries, red, yellow, and blue, combine to produce black or dark gray. But in practice, artists' pigments are not pure primaries, so the result is a sludgy gray-brown. Trace impurities in the pigments further sully them. So complex mixtures are needed to produce a range of hues found in Impressionist paintings. Blacks made from the subtractive mixture of bright, contrasting colors were widely used by the Impressionists, especially in the 1870s. The pigments most often employed were alizarin red, viridian green, and French ultramarine, very saturated hues with high tinting strength. Occasionally, the Impressionists included black pigment, but rarely more than a trace. Such colored blacks have been identified in, for example, the canopy and dark trains in Monet's The Gare Saint-Lazare, the Gare Saint-Lazare. These interesting darks result entirely from the admixture of contrasting, saturated hues, mainly red, with cobalt blue, cerulean blue, French ultramarine, viridian, and emerald green. There are only trace quantities of black pigment in this painting. Apart from the principle of abandoning blacks with the adoption of the spectral palette, it was technically problematic. Black tends to sully other colors, which is especially noticeable in mixtures with pale, bright pigments. Obtaining deep hues by subtractive color mixture enabled the Impressionists to avoid the dirtying presence of black pigment. This gave both color brilliance and a colorful black. By contrast, where pigment blacks dominated were employed extensively by the Impressionists only to represent black as a local color. Black outfits like that of Madame Boudin or Cassatt's Women in Black. Although pigment analysis reveals traces of black among the brilliant color mixtures in many Impressionist paintings, and by no means restricted to areas of shadows. The principal usage of black pigment, where it did occur, was as a color in its own right. And that last sentence is what is most important, because much of what I read probably sounded in great contrast to my earlier statements about the use of black paint. But it's not. People always give the overly dogmatic advice to never use black and to always mix your own, like that TikTok we just watched. Because black can become a very gray and dominating color of everything that it mixes with. That's what black is. It makes gray. If you're an impressionist whose whole philosophy revolves around making things as bright and chromatic as possible, especially when painting outdoors, then black is not a color that's gonna get a ton of frequent use. It's not super common to see pure black on a bright sunny day outside. What do you think is gonna happen if you mix a bright cadmium yellow with black? It's gonna get really desaturated. It's gonna get way darker and more gray. But that doesn't mean that black was never used in history. It was used. The principal usage of black pigment, where it did occur, was as a color in its own right. Black is a color like anything else. It pulls things towards the center of the color wheel, desaturating and making what you mix with it darker. If you have a color that you want to be less saturated and darker, then black is an excellent choice to add to it. But if you want to keep the purity of your colors as strong as possible for stylistic reasons, then black might not be the best choice. Although it still can be, even when used in those contexts, it's still fine. It just has to be controlled very precisely, which is why it's only found in trace amounts in much Impressionist work. I also want to make it very clear that Impressionists were not the first ones, or the only ones, to know that mixing complementary colors together made things darker without significantly reducing their saturation. This was very common knowledge among academic painters, and anyone painting in any of the Parisian ateliers around this time, they were all using colored shadows. This has been standard practice already for decades before the Impressionists. That's where the Impressionists learned it from even. The academics, they went to their ateliers. And this is taking place at the same time that we have painters like Dagnan or Lepage making paintings like this using black. So it certainly wasn't ruining their colors either. Perhaps some of this extreme dogma around not using black might come from Paul Signac's writing that's titled From Eugene Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I found this to be very strange and confusing. I mean, I'm probably just getting way too deep into the history of Impressionism here, which is far more deserving of its own video, but I'm just gonna oversimplify this for you guys. Paul Signac was a neo-impressionist. He made pointillist paintings with tiny little dots of pure color. Delacroix died in 1863, before Signac was even born, but his journals weren't published until the early 1890s, and then Signac read them and schizophrenically thought that a guy who painted like this was secretly signaling to him that pointillism was the future of painting or whatever, and that it was a natural progression of Delacroix to start doing all of this divisionism stuff. Signac wrote a post-impressionist manifesto taking very short quotes from Delacroix, like "the enemy of all painting is gray," and "ban all earthy colors," and then prescriptively maps them onto post-impressionist and impressionist doctrine to define things like impressionism as a palette only made up of pure colors, which are close to the ones of the color spectrum, which we already know isn't actually true in practice. And normally I would go back through Delacroix's journals and I would find the context of these statements and analyze his paintings and his palettes, but what are we even doing here? Of course, if you want to paint like this, and you only believe in optically mixing tiny little points of color to create visual effects, black isn't a good color for you to use. That's fine. You should use whatever colors help you achieve the goal of your painting. People that are dogmatically against the use of black painted in very specific styles that didn't need black. But that doesn't mean that you should take that advice for painting a realist portrait like the TikTok before, or that teachers should be giving that advice to their beginner painting 101 students. I want you all to take a more critical look at the things that you see online, especially in the art world. For some reason, it just seems like almost all of the commonly held truths just have very little real factual basis. or they've just maybe been repeated so many times, each with a small loss of context that they're completely flanderized from their original purpose. If instead we guide our education by focusing on what's most important, which is understanding the fundamental principles of why we do things, we have the ability to then make these choices on our own. I hope that learning about color gamut has made you a little bit more confident in your paint choices. Just choose whatever paints you want that give you enough range for what you're doing. And if it feels like you can't mix a color, then add another one on your palette that brings you a little bit closer to it. And most importantly, look at the art of the people that you take advice from. If they don't make art like you want to make, then their advice might not really be that beneficial to you. I'm not going to take realist painting advice from Signac. And I'm not going to take pointillism advice from Denyon. So yeah, I guess that's it.